pleasure to be here and to be among friends. Congratulations on completing 3 months of a policy writing course. Waziri has asked me to come and give a keynote address. And in his invitation, he said, oh, you can use your notes, you can write a paper, you can do, and I thought, if you've been through 3 months of a policy writing course, the last thing you want to hear is another lecture on policy. So I thought I'm not going to do that. We're going to have a conversation instead, and we're going to share experiences. And I hope to be able to learn from you some of what you've learned over the last 3 months, and also share from you the little I know about policy development, both academically and practically. I had to learn from a master, Shane Biddle, who worked in the London Borough of Ealing. There was something he asked me to write, and I must have written it 20 times. And each time I bring it, he will say, you're getting a little closer, but go back and try again. And I think the first paper that I wrote for Dr. Biddle, that his red pen wasn't all over it, I think I framed it and put it in my house. That was how important it was. Immediately after I'd achieved that milestone, he stopped looking at anything I was writing. He was perfectly confident that you have learned all the disciplines required, and that anything you write from now on, we can have differences of opinion, but the technical purity, I'm sure, will be there. So this discipline of being able to think clearly and to write clearly is of vital importance. And I'm not just talking about in your day-to-day work, even in your life as you develop in your career and as a human being. These are disciplines that are absolutely critical to have. The importance of this kind of training cannot be overemphasized for a number of reasons. Firstly, if you work in a ministry as a civil servant, your key role is actually to advise ministers on policy. That's your key role, right? If you're a civil servant, in the way that our service is structured. Your key role is actually not to deliver anything. It's actually to write advice and to help the minister to develop policy. If you work in an agency, your role is more of delivery, because what you do is what affects citizens on a day-to-day basis. So the Nigerian knows NAFDAC, doesn't really know Ministry of Health, to be honest. Nigeria knows FEMA, because what they do is what affects them on a day-to-day basis. But even in delivery, there's quite a lot of policy making, because policy is about choices, is about decisions that government make about what it wants to do to affect the lives of citizens. This is why this is so key. And if you look at the Constitution of Nigeria, it says that the primary business of government shall be the welfare and security of the people. Everything you do in government is actually about making decisions that should improve the welfare and security of citizens. Because once a group of people come together and agree to have a government, certain dynamics change. So if we lived without government, you can imagine that there will be quite a bit of chaos. There will be difficulties in setting boundaries between individual rights and individual freedoms and collective rights and collective freedoms. Without government, I can do anything I like. Okay? As Two-Face once sang, if to say na just me, I go to do anyhow. But once you decide to have a government, you can't do anyhow, because your rights and your freedoms is affected by and also affects somebody else's. If you think about human development in terms of health, education, economic growth, gender balance, all of those kinds of things, you start to see that there are very many different policy instruments, including the Constitution. So the second chapter of the Constitution basically talks about human development. Okay? Unfortunately, that section is not justiciable. You can't go to court and sue. In some countries, it is. In Brazil, for instance, you have a right to medicines from your government. You have a right. You don't have to pay. It is your right as a citizen of Brazil to get every medicine you need from your government. It says so in their constitution. You know what is even more interesting is that those medicines you get, the government cannot give you the cheapest. So you can say, no, I don't want Emzor paracetamol. I want that Panadol, the one in the pack from abroad. That's the one I want. And government must give you. If you look at education, in countries like New Zealand, as an example, it is your right to be educated by government. And you can sue the government for refusing to educate you. In whatever form you want that education, you have that right. In some other countries, you have an obligation to go to school. So you must complete primary and secondary education, whether you want it or not. The government forces you to do that. And so that's an example of policy that affects the human development of citizens. Policy is also important with regards to how resources are allocated. So the budget is also a policy document. An economist, Goldshield, once said, the budget is the skeleton of the state stripped of all misleading ideology. If you meet a politician, like Malam Bolaji used to be, if you've ever worked closely with a state governor, you know that the allocation letters he gives for land is more than the land available in the state. Okay? The allocation letters he gives, you just be getting allocation letter. Look, everybody will have. But come and get the land now. That's a different matter. And every governor, if you are ever made commissioner of lands in a state government, or you're made commissioner for finance in a state government, your governor just needs to look at you and he expects you to know who should get the land and who should not. He doesn't need to tell you. If he has to tell you, you are fired. If you are commissioner for finance, you are expected to know which invoice to approve and which ones he is just being political about and has just promised. Now, so the budget is the skeleton of the state, stripped of all misleading ideology. Means if it is not in the budget, it's just talk. You people are just debating. That, of course, assumes that the budget is realistic, the budget is properly developed, and the budget is complied with by the state. Policy also affects economic growth, affects poverty alleviation. So you have instances in which the government decides, for instance, to sell crude in Naira to Dangote. Okay? And there was a bit of a wobble at some point where they thought, oh, okay, no, maybe we're going to change that policy. And Dangote reacted and said, okay, fine, change it then. Then I'm going to be selling my petrol in dollars to other people who are willing to pay. And then common sense prevailed and he came back. It can affect the way that the economy works. It can affect poverty alleviation. So things like the free school meals projects that are being done, trader money, or what different schemes are policy schemes that governments decide to put in place. There are many other things, there are many other reasons why policy development is vitally important in governance. And like I said, there are different policy instruments, and each of these instruments depicts different kinds of public policy. Okay, so you can have a public policy that is regulatory. Can anyone give me an example?
Some of the regulatory policies are policies developed to govern certain agencies in government. Maybe let's take, for example, the NAFDAC that was mentioned earlier. Regulatory policies are developed to govern their activity and their mandate as an agency.
Excellent. So you're not allowed to bear firearms in Nigeria without a license. Okay, so that's a regulatory policy. You also have policies that are distributive, that talk about how the Commonwealth is to be utilized. Who wants to give me an example?
Tax policy could be an example of that in terms of distribution of wealth within the country and where certain things should be allocated.
Germany decided that all tuition would be free at all levels, both for citizens and non-citizens. Anybody in Germany gets free education. Doesn't matter where you're from. You know, it's a bit different from the UK, where there's a huge difference between what the citizen pays and what the non-citizen pays. But in Germany, all tuition is free, whether you're a citizen or not. So that's a means of using the Commonwealth for a particular purpose. So we're distributing our Commonwealth to focus on education. And it doesn't matter whether you're German or non-German. So long as you're in our country, you get free education. I prefer to refer to tax policy when I talk about redistributive policy. So if you think about some of the tax policies that my brother Taiwo has been working on with Tayo and others, about changing the way that the tax system in Nigeria works. Okay, so maybe making sure that, you know, small businesses and the poorest don't actually pay any tax, and then other people pay. So that's a means of redistributing. So it's really, really important to have that rigor to go through the problem identification before you start to think about what you want to change. Okay? So always start with the problem identification before you talk about an agenda for changing it. What I find in government, having been in government, is that those that develop policy do not give decision makers sufficient analysis and options with which to make decisions. And I've seen it over and over again, where people have said, you know, if you take this to the president, he will never approve it. Take this to the minister, he will never approve it. You take it to them and they will say, nobody has ever brought me these options. I didn't even know I could do this. So we mask our inability to do proper policy and blame everything on the decision maker. There's no decision maker that doesn't want glory. There's nobody that doesn't want to succeed. So if you give them the options that enable them to succeed, they can decide not to go with what you've said, but at least you would have done a good job by presenting the options in front of them. Then you need to implement. I've written a paper, you can Google it. It's called Africa's problem is planning, not implementation. Controversial, right? And by that, I basically meant that our weakness in implementation is as a result of our weakness in planning and preparation. And so most things that we produce are inherently unimplementable. And therefore, when you say our problem is implementation, you miss the trick. We can implement as well as anyone. If you've ever seen us do fraud, we don't have an implementation problem. When we do fraud, do we? We don't have. But look at the meticulous planning that goes into doing fraud. Look at it. And so you ask yourself, okay, this person that is able to commit this level of fraud, can you imagine all of the things they would have thought about? They would have thought about, what if this happens? This is what I'm going to do. How do I present this such that it is convincing? What data do I need to use? How do I sell this thing to this person? Do we go through that process when we develop policy? We hardly do. We hardly do. And that's why when some of these 419 guys call me and they come to try their luck, I say to them, I can help you improve. I can help you improve how you do this, but you will pay. I'm a consultant now. A lot of the policy implementation is also fraught with weakness. Okay? It's fraught with weakness. We don't do contingency planning. We don't plan in resources, human and financial. Most of our planning is based on hope. And if you ask any Nigerian policy developer, oh, what happens if this goes wrong? The answer is usually, God will not let it happen. That's the extent of our intellectual engagement when we do policy. Evaluation, which we don't do enough of. Okay? We don't do enough of evaluation to learn from what has worked, why has it worked, and what do we need to change. You've probably spent the last 3 months learning how to do policy. It's also vitally important that you learn how not to do policy. And if you haven't done so already, please read Waziri's article on the cash confiscation policy of 2023. Right? Actually, when I teach policy, that's the case study I use when I teach policy, because it tells you everything you shouldn't do. Okay, people say to me, oh, I'd like you to mentor me on policy development. And I say, okay, go through everything Emefiele did and do the exact opposite. You would have learned how to do policy. Okay? So go through Waziri's paper, because he identifies a number of lessons, including that policy making is not always about brute force. Quite often it's about consultation. It talks about good intentions not being enough. So many people will say, oh yeah, the intention was good, but the problem was the execution. Good intentions are not enough. It shows you that approval from a higher authority is not enough when you've done the wrong thing. Okay? Buhari approved the cashless thing, didn't he? Who is facing the music today? Emefiele. So even approval from a higher authority when you've done the wrong thing is not enough. He also talks about capacity to learn, the humility to admit error, talked about the need for consultation, talked about that if you're doing policy, if you cannot do things that will improve the lives of citizens, at least do not make it worse. So again, his paper said that policy failed the do no harm test. So if you haven't used it as part of your 3-month course, I would strongly recommend that you read Waziri's article in that regard. Because one of the hallmarks of the kind of proper training that Tayo was talking about and that I'd relayed my own experience to you about is that once you've done it properly, you go home and sleep and your conscience will be at peace. That I have done the proper thing, I have laid out the policy with all the evidence of what needs to be done, and I can tell you that from my own experience, a lot of what you lay out may actually outlive you when it is done. So don't be discouraged, because the likelihood is, oh, you've written something, you're disappointed that the logic is so obvious that you're disappointed that they didn't just take it and run with it. And that dampens your spirit and dampens your enthusiasm. Don't let that happen. We're beginning to see some improvements in passport administration in Nigeria. I did that work in 2013. That's 12 years ago. I left government, it will be 8 years ago in August. It is just now that we are getting there. The NIMC, the National Identity System, they were not able to give Nigerians national ID cards. Some people have been waiting 10 years for national ID cards. Problem analysis, they cannot give people national ID cards because government was not giving them money to print national ID cards. Each ID card cost 3,000 naira to print. They were not allowed to sell it to citizens, and government was not giving them the money to print the cards. So we said, okay, so what is this obsession with cards? Why don't you move to the national insurance and national identity number? Everybody knows their BVN. Nobody has a BVN card. What is this obsession with cards? Let's focus on numbers. Let's bring in the data from the telecommunications company. Let's link it to passport data. Let's link it to driver's licensing data. And from when NIMC was set up in 2007 to when we're doing this work in 2015, they had 7 million records. Between when we started that work in 2015 and today, they have 110 million records. And it was simply by just switching the mindset. Sometimes it is not what you say that happens immediately. JFK said in 1961 that it should be the ambition of the US to land a man on the moon and bring him safely back to Earth before the decade is out. The US achieved that in 1969, 68, 69. JFK had been murdered by then. And so sometimes what you do, if done properly, will outlive you. That's what I want to leave you with. Thank you for your time.